more than 150 NGOs worldwide to support efforts to develop a uranium weapons treaty that would prohibit the use of uranium in all conventional weapons and weapon systems. Our main focus has been to inform and advise policymakers and governments on the threats to human health and the environment of uranium weapons. We produce and disseminate information, offer advice to member groups, and encourage domestic and regional coalition building and skills sharing. The organization I represent within ICBUW, the San Jose, Costa Rica Quaker Peace Center, joined the campaign encouraged by the testimony of a neighbor affected by a DU test site in Socorro, New Mexico, and by the associated stories and photographs of photojournalist Naomi Toyota from Japan on exhibition here tonight. I first met Naomi and members of ICBUW when we organized the first Latin American conference on uranium weapons in the capital of Costa Rica in March 2009. In the United States, organizations such as Veterans for Peace, after the first occupation of Iraq where DU was used, Veterans for Peace formed a working group to raise awareness on this issue, active to this day. Physicians for Social Responsibility as well have spoken out and produced scientific reports. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has joined these efforts and established contact with its branches, informing on this issue and on the upcoming 4th resolution on depleted uranium weapons to be discussed in the first committee this month of October and voted on by November 7th. Concerns in the U.S. have been expressed in communities such as Jonesboro, Tennessee, where DU penetrators are assembled by Airjet Ordnance. Members of Airjet Action, with the support of Christian Peace Teammakers, are carrying out detailed lab analysis of water and soil samples in their community due to concerns over the levels of radiation being released by this company. Stronger contact with other local groups such as CREW, Citizens Research and Environmental Watch, and Grassroots Action in Massachusetts need to be rekindled to share experiences on CREW's involvement in helping to shut down StarMet in Concord, which also produced DU penetrators now converted into a Superfund site by the federal government, with a cost to U.S. taxpayers of $64 billion. The experience of Colony in New York is important to know, and how national-led industries who use depleted uranium for 30-millimeter cannon penetrators for an Air Force contract until 1980 was discharging into the surrounding atmosphere 10 times the allowable state standard before it shut down in the late 70s, the cleanup cost being more than $190 million. Meanwhile, in the U.S. Congress, bills are shelved due to lack of political will. H.R. 248, the Depleted Uranium Screening and Testing Act, presented by Representative Jose Serrano from New York, currently has no co-signers. One of his staffers has expressed interest in reintroducing the bill with our input at the end of this year, but we wonder how far this will go. Testing of veterans who return from wars where DU has been used has been criticized as limited in its scope. Work with anti-nuclear organizations across the country needs to be strengthened to also track the transportation of radioactive, chemically toxic waste on U.S. roads. Coinciding with the Veterans for Peace 27th Annual Convention in Miami last August, ICBUW, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Veterans for Peace, launched an online petition on change.org calling on Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with copies to President Barack Obama, and UN Ambassador Susan Rice, to change their voting record on DU at the General Assembly in 3 weeks. The US, UK, Israel, and France need to be continually pressured into renouncing their support to these indiscriminate weapons. Similar actions are being taken in Australia by Australian organizers pressuring their government, one of 30 abstainers on the 2010 vote, which was the last vote 2 years ago. We are thankful for the support of organizations such as Friends of the Earth and Pax Christi, USA and International on this call. And with your support, we can bring many more on board. Please, before you leave tonight, take the information we have on the tables and our brochure. And on our website, you can also join us by signing on this petition to strengthen this effort before the fourth resolution vote. We hope you will stay after the presentations, and we would welcome your ideas on continuing work in the US in 2013. 3 of the papers presented this evening have been distributed to UN mission representatives we have met with since October 8th and are valuable in our efforts at the UN. We are very thankful for the sponsorship of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to our research projects. We thank Gretel Monroe, Katsumi Furitsu, and Wim Zwijnenburg for preparing and sharing their reports this evening. And we are saddened because Doug Weir, the coordinator of ICBUW, who has its office in Manchester, England, cannot be with us tonight because he is ill. He sends his regards. Wim will be presenting, following me, Precaution in Practice, challenging the acceptability of depleted uranium weapons. He will also present another research called the Hazard Aware Report, Lessons Learned from Military Field Manuals on Depleted Uranium and How to Move Forward for Civilian Protection Norms. Wim works on IKV Pax Christi's Security and Disarmament Desk, which carries out research on disarmament practices in various countries and supports national and international civil society measures that encourage governments to comply with disarmament treaties. Wim currently works on making an assessment of the impact of DU in Iraq, and as part of that program, made several trips to Iraq to talk with the Iraqi government, doctors, and national and international NGOs working on demining, healthcare, and human rights about their work and experience with DU. He will be followed by Dr. Katsumi Furitsu and Gretel Monroe of the ICBUW science team, who will present on DU and DNA, research on what we know about DU as a genotoxin and carcinogen. Dr. Furitsu is a physician, a specialist in radiation biology and medical genetics. Based in Osaka, Japan, Katsumi has recently been honored in recognition of her 30 years' work with the Japanese Ibakusha, with communities affected by the fallout from Chernobyl, indigenous communities contaminated by uranium mining, and the impact of depleted uranium munitions. Since March 2011, Katsumi has been visiting Fukushima to give the residents advice and communicating the health and social impact of the Fukushima disaster to colleagues and campaigners in Japan and around the world. Gretel Monroe is a registered dietitian, a member of Grassroots Action for Peace, Concord, where Nuclear Metals StarMet manufactured DU penetrator shells for 25 years. Her preparatory work for human nutrition, in which she holds an MS degree from the University of Massachusetts, included a course in physics. Each report presentation will take no longer than 20 minutes. Presentation should be over at about 7:15. We welcome your comments and questions after the presentations and invite you to stay on and informally gather those who can. Welcome again.
Okay.
Do you want me to turn the lights off?
Yeah, would be good.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here. First of all, I would like to make my apologies. First of all, I would like to make my apologies. I'm also not very well. Can everybody hear me in the back? Is it okay? Yeah? Okay. I also am down with a cold, and so is Doug. We've been working the whole year on these reports. So apparently, if it comes to health effects of depleted uranium, here's one for you. Apart from all the sloppy jokes aside, first I'm going to give the Doug's presentation, and so I'm not totally familiar with every detail of his presentation, but I do my best as I do my best to represent his work.
And can we higher it a little bit? It's really difficult behind.
Yeah. So I'll do my best to represent his work, and if you have any specific questions, we can discuss it afterwards. So, first of all, this is an introduction in depleted uranium. As you can see here, this is depleted uranium is a dense heavy metal. It's it's denser than lead, 1.7 times denser than lead. It's been used in several military systems. You can see the A10. Okay, louder. So. Okay. Anyway, might start doing more bad jokes if I'm talking like this. This is the DU penetrator, which is used in tanks, but it's also being deployed in other systems, as you can see in military in airplanes, which have a rotary cannon which fires a lot of DU, and in Bradley vehicles also an military system which is capable of firing a large amount of DU rounds in a short period of time. So it's a dense heavy metal. It's also pyrophoric, which means upon impact it will burn into a fine dust, which is one of the biggest problems with DU. DU is a kinetic energy penetrator, so instead of explosive, it will use speed and its heaviness, and so it creates a heavy kinetic energy impact, which allows it to penetrate armor. Well, since the use of DU in 1991 and later on in 2003, Iraqi doctors have reporting an increase of rates in cancers and birth congenital malformations. You see some of the pictures here, which were related to the use of depleted uranium. On those effects we will talk about later. And DU is also seen as a potential risk factors for these kind of health problems because of its chemical toxicity and its radioactivity. So the reason why this report was written is about the precautionary principle. So the idea behind it is that if civilians are exposed to DU after armed conflict, we think the precautionary principle should apply. The precautionary principle is the basis for peacetime environmental and health protection norms. So, for example, if you want to introduce a new kind of element in food or in other kind of products, it should be tested. And then in the test, they're going to make an assessment what the potential effects are, and if the effects are increasing risk on health, then usually the precautionary principle is applied. One of those applications is in EU environmental law, in customary international humanitarian law, and we also saw the same kind of idea in the Convention of Cluster Munitions, where, for example, the problem with cluster munitions was there was no recording of data on the effect of civilian casualties, and so therefore states were challenged to record these casualties and thereby reversing the burden of proof on when there is an effect and when a population is exposed to cluster munitions. And the same thing is we should like to see also with depleted uranium. So when do we need to act if you apply a precautionary principle? So we have to know, what do we know about the nature of DU as a hazard? And can we accurately quantify the risk DU poses to health? What factors influence the risk it poses when it's used in conflict? What factors influence the risk it poses after conflict? And does this justify the application of the precautionary principle? So first of all, we start with DU as a hazard. DU is a known radioactive, chemically toxic alpha particle emitter. There's an inhalation hazard from fine particles in groundwater contamination. So this refers mainly to if the DU dust is released after impact and it's been inhaled, then it will have an impact, then have a potential health effect on the You're trying to turn it up? Yeah? Okay. Better? Okay. Yeah, sorry, my voice is a bit down. So, what do we see here? We have the U.S. Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute have conducted a lot of tests over the last couple of years on tissue samples, so for example in petri dishes and in test tubes, and on animal testing. What they found was DU is mutagenic, genotoxic, and it induces genomic instability. My colleagues will talk more about that later. I'm not an expert on that. And also on in vivo tests on test animals, they also found that different health effects were occurring when the test animals were exposed to depleted uranium. This is in line with peer-reviewed literature over the last couple of years, which showed the same kind of impact on different tissues and test animals. So is depleted uranium a hazard? Well, that depends on how you define hazard and how you define risk. This is a quote from the UK Ministry of Defence, when they state that they don't consider DU as safe and DU as hazardous. So we've seen that, and I will come back to that later, there are strict military regulations to avoid exposed personnel. There are strict national regulations to avoid domestic releases. So if DU is being released in the environment, for example in the US, or in my case in the Netherlands, or name any other country, there are strict regulations how to clean it up and how to protect the environment and how to protect the civilians living in those areas. And both all international organizations working on this issue, such as UNEP, International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, and the Royal Society, all advocate cleanup and monitoring of sites where DU has been used. So how do we quantify the risk from depleted uranium? Well, we've seen now that DU is already established as a hazardous toxic material. So can we accurately quantify the risk it poses to civilians? The European Union Scientific Committee examining health and environmental risk, they did a risk assessment study in 2010. The outcome was that they're unable to accurately model risk because we don't have insufficient data on civilian exposures. So, for example, there was one study included in this study, which was only they did a survey on 24 people, but it was unknown if those people were exposed to DU or not. And which is, if you want to do a large-scale study and you want to quantify risk, you have at least need a group larger than, I would say, 500 people to, and also you should know if they live in contaminated areas or not. So we don't have data on civilian exposures, and there is no epidemiological study being conducted in Iraq in exposed areas. Also, we don't have insufficient data on how different tissue respond to a DU dose. What we know, for example, only know is about what's been talked a lot about is the dose-effect relationship. So after being exposed to a certain dose, you have an effect. So, but only studies done so far have looked at the kidney and lung exposure. But what we know from the studies from Alexandra Miller from the AFRI, which I mentioned earlier, show that DU can travel throughout the whole body and can affect different organs. And we don't know anything about how those kind of organs will be affected and what the dose is on when a certain effect will occur. Another problem is we don't know the size and the particle of the DU. So if DU is being used and you get DU dust, we have no idea how big the particles are. So it's hard to make a risk model because we don't know how it will travel to the body and what kind of where DU will remain in the body or it will be released. I already mentioned this one. So far we have seen that available science is unable to accurately quantify the risk of a known hazard, in which in case of a normal civilian peacetime risk assessment, a precautionary principle should be invoked. Now we look at conflict. So is DU in conflict predictable? Well, we know there is a hazard. There's insufficient data to quantify the exact health and environmental risk. So is it used in conflict predictable or controlled? Now here are some quotes about a review which was done on the A-10, which fires a lot of DU, and this review was done by the US Air Force, and it shows that that in certain if it's used in certain areas, for example, against civilian targets, the risks are potentially dangerous to friendly civilian populations as well as enemy populations. This, for example, is the use of the picture is quite vague, but this is the Iraqi Ministry of Planning, which was attacked by an A-10 in 2003, where large quantities of DU was found in the vicinity of the building on the ground. And so you can see here this is a clear example of where DU is being used against a non-armored target and releasing DU in an uncontrolled manner in a civilian area. So is the use in conflict predictable? Well, there are a lot of questions you should ask if you want to make sure if it's predictable or not. Here are some of the questions we have. So we need to know what kind of DU round was used. Was it used against a specific military object, and is the destroyed object still present? Is the bulk of the contamination in the soil? For example, when an A-10 attacks a target, most of the penetrators will miss the target and end up in the soil. But then again, you have to know where the target is. Have been any buildings been attacked? And how much of the DU was fired at each location? These are all this is all data which is needed to make an assessment about the predictability of depleted uranium, but so far we don't have any of this data, for example in Iraq. So this is the problem of transparency over the use of depleted uranium. Is it properly managed after conflict? Well, like I mentioned, the UK released some data of depleted uranium in Iraq after 2003, which was 1.5, added up to 1.5 tons, but in what we know so far, over 440 tons have been used, and that's a conservative estimate. UNEP said over between 1,000 and 2,000 tons have been fired. But we only use the data we have received from the Americans. But the data was incomplete, by the way. Like I said, if you want to know where it has been used, if you want to clean up, you have to know how much has been used and where it has been used. Otherwise, it's really hard to clean up the areas which are contaminated. And so far, the United States actively refused to release those data or stated that they have lost the data, which was an official reaction to a request from UNEP. And also from the Iraqi government, I met with several representatives last week in Baghdad, and they said they made a request to the US, and the only thing they received was a vague map of military operations, where military operations took place. So it's still hard for them to make sure where it has been used, so they can go in and do an assessment of the soil and of the groundwater and potentially of civilian buildings. So we've seen here there are serious implications for civilian exposure, and problems with efficient cleanup. Now, in 2010, 148 states requested transparency over the use of DU. So far, we haven't got any. And that leads us to another problem. If you have transparency, do states have capacity to clean it up? Well, I can tell you from my own experience what I've seen in Iraq. The Iraqi government has a lot of problems, also with environmental pollution, but also security-wise, socioeconomic development. They have no expertise, or they have little expertise. They have some expertise because they were trained by UNEP in 2005 to do some cleanup and measurements, but they're still lacking enough expertise to make assessment of all the contaminated sites. Contamination is very expensive. For example, I was told if you want to do a right assessment of a site, it will cost between $100,000 and $150,000, and there are now over 300 known sites. You have to store contaminated material, and also there are no international mechanisms in place to provide funding and capacity. Well, we try to achieve that at the moment here in the UN to see if we get support from that. And awareness of the EU in the mining community is very low. Also something I experienced firsthand when I was talking with the mining agencies in Iraq. So here's an example of good practice. This is in Serbia, where they cleaned up contaminated soil and put protection measures in place. And these are some examples in Iraq, where the EU was just found lying on the ground with improvised signs for people to warn them that there is DU. So if DU is a hazard, is everything that can be done to reduce the risk of exposure being done? Well, so far, no. There are little awareness programs being undertaken so far in Iraq. And they have other priorities. Radiation hazards also create a significant psychological burden, because if you start talking about radiation, people get really scared, and you also want to prevent that people get scared if it's not really necessary, because you have little information about if it's used or not. So you have to be really careful on how to approach that. And also those programs being designed so far, designing those programs is really difficult. I'll quickly move on. So can we accurately measure the post-conflict health impact of DU? Well, it's a big problem in Iraq, for example, because they're rebuilding the healthcare system, and a lot of their experts moved abroad. Other issues, I just quickly go through this because lack of time. So just to reiterate and what we know so far, is DU a hazard? Yes. Can the best available data show that it possesses no risk to civilians? No. Does the way that DU is used in conflict increases the risk to civilians? Yes, because it's uncontrolled and we don't have any information where it has been used. Does the way that DU is managed after conflict increases the risk to civilians? Yes. Do the difficulties in studying civilian health after conflict support a precautionary approach? Yes. So, is it essential or unacceptable? Well, there are a lot of arguments made by militaries saying that depleted uranium is needed to because it's one of the best weapons available, but there are certain other weapons that are now currently being used which also have the same effect, and if being adapted, they can also have the same efficiency as depleted uranium. So now we come to the process, is it politically or publicly acceptable? I think this is an answer which is something which should not be part of politics, but the public should decide about that. If you ask a random person in the street if you think it's a good idea to put low-level or medium-level radioactive waste into conventional weapons and fire it in an uncontrolled manner, I think the average person would say no. So why should we ban depleted uranium? Well, we've seen as well in the last decades that wars are increasingly fought in civilian areas. So the likelihood that the DU is used against non-armored target and civilian buildings will also increase. It's indiscriminate and it's hazardous. It poses a health and environmental risk, and it places a significant burden on states recovering from conflict. So what we're now working on here is we've seen the anti-personnel landmine ban in 1997, cluster munitions were banned in 2008, and we're now working forward to a ban of depleted uranium or any other form of uranium used in the conventional weapons. And we hope to achieve that soon. So this was, in short, a presentation. It was I guess I left a lot out because it was not my presentation, but at least you get a sort of an idea of the background on why we think precautionary principles should be applied in regarding depleted uranium. And I will now continue with my next presentation, which is about hazard awareness. Okay, way more familiar with this one. So, right. A year ago, thank you. Yeah. Oh, actually, there's a guy living in the same city who is also has the same name, but he is actually working in the funeral business. So I think it would be my last bad joke if I die before him. I would be buried by the same guy, just for confusion. Anyway. I wrote this report because I came across a lot of military guidelines which showed that there was the military provided guidelines for their own troops to protect themselves against exposure to depleted uranium, which I find really interesting because internationally the same states who've been fighting against the work we're doing so far state that depleted uranium is not a problem, and at the same time providing all these kind of materials for their own troops. And we thought, well, if you provide those kind of materials for their own troops, we also think it would be fair to protect the civilians in the areas where you use those weapons as well against the effects of those weapons. So we made an analysis of 6 different manuals and came up with ideas from those manuals to see, okay, how can we apply these military guidelines for civilian protection norms? So, well, I've talked a bit about use of depleted uranium in a previous presentation. We've known in the Balkans over 11,000 kilograms DU has been fired, and in Iraq over 400,000 kilograms of DU has been fired. So now we're going to define DU from the military perspective. How do they perceive DU and what do they tell their own troops? Well, I used manuals from 6 different armed forces: the US Army, the United Kingdom, NATO, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. The first 2 are users of depleted uranium. France possesses DU, but so far they haven't actively used it in conflict. But they use it on some test sites, but that's another issue. So how do those armed forces label DU? Well, the UK says that DU is a low specific activity radioactive material and presents 2 hazards: radiological and toxic hazard. The same is also echoed in the US position. Belgium, Netherlands doesn't give a specific definition, but refers to a report from the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, and who describe DU as limited chemically toxic and is a low-level radiotoxic material. Germany also states that DU is toxic and radioactive, and NATO use pretty much the same words as well. So what they all do is they all accept the fact that it is a radioactive and toxic material, which is interesting because we'll see later on how that it's reflected in the other wording. So what do you say about the health effects of DU to their own troops? The UK states that only on the worst case conditions there would be indicate there is no appreciable radiation health risk from DU, and the toxic hazard is presented by inhalation and ingestion of DU dust, which I can concur that it's indeed that's the biggest issue so far. The US says that adverse health effects may only occur for intake that greatly exceeds the US safety standards, And also strangely, another guidelines say that despite the misconception that uranium is highly toxic, it isn't. Which contradicts the previous statements in another guideline, which they state that it's a radioactive material and it's chemically toxic. Another problem is they say as well that, that's later, but they say they make mentions about studies that on epidemiological studies being conducted in certain areas, but so far we haven't seen any of those studies being conducted, for example in Iraq, where it has been used on a wide scale. Also Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany all acknowledge the fact that if there's internal contamination, there would be a potential health effect. So what kind of procedure do they put in place for their own troops? They all say that you shouldn't touch DU or contaminated vehicles. You should cover your skin. Use masks to protect yourself if you are in a contaminated area. You should not eat, drink, or smoke during activities in contaminated areas. Stay upwind from burning vehicles. Stay away from contaminated vehicles. Wash yourself and dust off uniform and shoes, and limit your stay in contaminated areas as much as possible. Well, as you can imagine, as a civilian living in Iraq in an area where it has been used, none of these field procedures is likely to be applied, or if you don't have any awareness on this, so people are likely to be exposed to depleted uranium in those areas. They also have some additional procedures, like the previous ones were the ones I could find in all the military manuals, and these are the ones I could find in some of them. So sort of seal off the perimeter of around seal off the part of the object which is contaminated, send in special teams, take radiation measurements with special equipment, and troops should take a range of biosamples, so they could biomonitor the troops to see if on long term if there will be an effect or not. Now you see here some pictures of the depleted uranium being found, and these are the penetrators being stored. It's quite interesting. I heard stories from people in Iraq who were in there in 2003 and collected different penetrators, but they had no idea what kind of way they were disposed. And also the local population in the areas where they found those penetrators hardly got any information at all on the dangers of those penetrators. Now, so United Nations Environment Program did a field study in Iraq and provided technical support to the Iraqi government and trained local experts on how to take samples and how to measure radiation. And they came up with a lot of these 6 points on what kind of work should be undertaken to limit further exposure, which are all precautionary points. So you'll see that there would be a need for support from the international community to main staff and expertise. And so far, little support from the international community is given to implement these measures. Equipment hit by military equipment hit by the EU should be identified and isolated. Well, we don't have any information. No information is given on which kind of material was contaminated, so it's quite difficult to identify those kind of materials. So what they did was went in there with their limited equipment and take measurements. And scrap metal yards should be assessed for potential presence of DU. Well, I came across one example in Al Zubair in the south, where the local guard of a scrap metal site told me that indeed an international organization came in, did measurement measurements of the contaminated scrap, and then told them it was very dangerous, and his words then quickly ran off, providing no specifics on how to protect themselves, nor did they do anything to make sure the scrap metal site would be inaccessible for people, and there were still children playing around there, and it was a small village next to the scrap metal yard. Other health and safety precautions should be undertaken. Well, so far I haven't come across a lot of those precautions in those affected areas. Also education awareness efforts should be undertaken, which was done to a certain amount in certain areas, because they don't know which areas exactly were contaminated. So they only went in the areas where they thought it was it was contaminated and did some awareness raising programs there, but stopped after a while because they had no more funding. And also it's another issue they mentioned was the storage and disposal of the contaminated scrap metal. This was also done to a limited extent in certain areas. Still those scrap metal sites remain publicly accessible, and no operations have been undertaken to decontaminate the material. If you have certain contaminated scrap metals, the best operational procedure, which was recommended by the IAEA, was to wrap it in plastic and bury it at least 6 meters deep in the ground. But so far, none of that has been done. There are even known reports that contaminated scrap metals being reprocessed in steel factories, thereby again contaminating the local environment if you start burning those vehicles or melting them, but releasing the particles again. So what do we learn now from civilian protection norms? Well, we've seen so far there's a clear acceptance of a hazard of the EU, which led to designing those safety procedures and precautionary measures for troops. But so far there are protection. There's no protection of civilians after armed conflict where the EU has been used. One part because user states refuse to take responsibility because they're afraid if you take responsibility you have to pay for the cleanup as well. Also they would lose one of their gadgets, which is according to US problematic because they say it's very efficient. And also there's a lack of capacity and resources of the affected states. What I mentioned earlier, in Iraq they don't have the resources, or they have limited resources or limited expertise, and they're facing many other problems there as well, which I can imagine as a priority. So here are some exposure scenarios in Iraq. The first one is a scrap metal site in Al Zubair, where you can see this is south of a village. There's an open scrap metal where there was civilian scrap metal and military scrap metal stored. When I arrived there, the military scrap metal was moved 2 weeks before that. So it has been stored there since 2003 and accessible to all the civilians living in these areas. And one of the problems in Iraq is that those scrap metal sites are a main source of income for the people living there. And it's not very easy for them to move somewhere else and get another way of getting an income. So they're sort of, well, it's the only option they have. So that's what they do, and they accept the risks associated with living there. The other picture is the one near a steel factory in the desert, where a lot of other scrap metal collectors still work. As you can see, it's not very clear here, but it's a tank, a contaminated DU tank, where they just put some barbed wire around it, but you can just walk up on there, and there are no signs put out there. There are no specific protection being put in place, so people making it inaccessible for people. And local scrap metal collectors were just driving around there and still picking things up. So the UNEP recommendations were not implemented there. So we came up with the following 6 civilian-centered strategies for post-conflict EU management. It's a bit small, so I'll read it out. Following the use of depleted uranium, contamination may be present in and around vehicles, buildings and infrastructure. Therefore, surface contamination may comprise of dust, fragments and intact penetrators. And air-launched DU rounds will lead to subsurface soil and water contamination. Next step would be assessment of those sites which were contaminated. The result of those assessments should inform an action plan and prioritize cleanup. Then a cleanup operation should be undertaken in cooperation with experts for a safe removal and long-term storage of contaminated soils and materials. And also local communities should be engaged before, during and after the project, so they are aware of what's happening and they can see if it's cleaned up, they can feel more safe and they're being informed about the hazards, or if there are any big health hazard, but at least they have knowledge and they have a point where they can go to when there are concerns, which will hopefully lead to a less of a psychological burden, because people can be reassured that the work has been undertaken to clean it up. There should also be marking of sites. So, for example, if you have a contaminated site, you should put a fence around it, put on warning signals, and until action is undertaken to clean it up. Furthermore, there would be what's needed is monitoring, long-term monitoring of soil, water, and biological indicators. So, and also, if there's a heavy contamination, biosamples could be taken to see if there is any contamination has taken place on the civilians living there. So if there would be an increase of certain health problems, then you could make sure if that could be related to depleted uranium or not. And as last part, awareness raising should be undertaken. So communities in areas where DU contamination has taken place should be informed about potential risk from DU. And then of course it should be balanced in such a way you don't immediately frighten people when you start talking about radiation or chemical toxicity, because you need to have to find a balanced way to tell that kind of information. And especially certain target groups such as scrap metal collectors and children should be warned about these hazards, because children are known to play around on tanks or other military vehicles because it's exciting and it's yeah, well, no. Usually when I was a kid, I always try to look for the boundaries and go as far as you can, even though it's dangerous. So I can imagine it happens there as well. So basically we come here to erring on the safe side. We can see that the socio, economical, political and humanitarian costs of the use of the EU outweigh the military necessity. It puts a huge burden on the state, it costs a lot of money to clean it up, it will create a lot of concerns among civilian population, and states after armed conflict, like I mentioned earlier, can imagine they have other priorities. Another problem we see that they lack expertise and capacity. One exception was Serbia, where the EU was used after in 1999, and Serbia already had a lot of good institutions in place, and they were able to immediately do good cleanup operations and store the contaminated soil, and which was an exception. For example, in Iraq, it's a different story. So based on these outcomes, we say as an organization, well, it should have no place in conventional weapons. So just adding up the conclusions and recommendations, we can see there is an acceptance of hazard among the military on the toxicity of depleted uranium. We clearly see there's a need of information on where depleted uranium has been used, and then how much has been used, what are the exact firing coordinates against what kind of targets has it been used. And there's a need for capacity building from the national institutions who are responsible for dealing with these kind of problems. For example, in Iraq it would be the Radiation Protection Center and Ministry of Science and Technology. They have some equipment, but it's not sufficient enough to take the right measurements or do all the measurements they actually need to do, because every month they get new reports coming in from local field groups that they found more contaminated sites, or be it like one penetrator or whole tank. There's a need for awareness raising in those contaminated areas to do the risk education for people, to make sure that if people are, like in some areas it might very well be that people are concerned about it, but the problem, for example, in Iraq is during the Saddam regime, it was also used as a political mean to say, look what the US has done. And in after 2003, it was also used by local groups to put the blame on the national government or to use it against American forces. And so people saw images on TV or in the newspapers about contaminated sites. They saw horrible pictures of deformed babies and cancers, and the link was directly made with depleted uranium. Well, not all the cases. This was, I mean, there are many causes for the increase of cancer in Iraq, for example, there's an increase of breast cancer, an increase of lung cancer, which can be related to smoking, bad diet, better registration mechanisms. But still, this image keeps echoing in the back of the mind of the people that they think it's all because of DU. So I think we should be careful on how to approach this, but at least it has an impact on people. And in the end, it will lead up for us as a conclusion that this precautionary approach should be undertaken considering all the problems we've seen and all the uncertainties we've seen on the effects and the impact of DU on the environment and the health. And on the health part, my colleagues will now take over. Again, my apologies for I'm still a bit sick, so but I hope it was a bit clear. And if you have any further questions, I think we take questions after the presentation from Katsumi and Gretel. The specific reports can be found in the back, both the precautionary practice and my hazard aware paper. And well, thank you very much for listening, and hope to answer your questions later.
He's too tall for me.
Use the one in your hand, you don't need the other one.
I'm too small compared to him. So anyway, good evening, everybody. And yeah, now it's a time for science class. But anyway, don't worry, our presentation is not so long, I hope. But anyway, we have been reviewing the studies of genotoxicity of depleted uranium, and in the process of making a report. But unfortunately, the report could not be finished in time for this seminar. But we are willing to send them out to all of you soon after we finalize it. And the report will be on the ICBUW website. And as you know, there is a considerable amount of basic scientific evidence from both animal and cellular studies that suggest possible deleterious effects on human health, respiratory, renal, neurological, immunological disorders, and as well as cancers. In our coming report, we will focus on genotoxicity because it is one of the important markers for the evaluation of environmental pollutant in many countries. And I just want to show you two slides. Wim told you that this black smoke contains fine particles of uranium, so people can easily breathe, not only soldiers but also the civilians. As you can see, I took it from the UNEP report, you know, that this 11-year-old boy named Ayat is trying to find out some cellular, he wanted to sell the metals which was taken from this, probably contaminated by DU. So in such way, many civilians, including children, can be exposed. So that's why we are demanding to ban uranium weapons. But anyway, as you may know, depleted uranium could affect human body through radiological toxicity and chemical toxicity. Alpha particles is very toxic when it is inside normal body because it's powerful. A possible synergetic effect of these two toxicity is also pointed out. It is also considered that DU particles created by the use of DU weapons are toxic only because of their small size. Sorry. And genotoxicity is defined as a damaging to DNA, which may cause mutations. Mutation of a cell may lead to cancer or transgenerational effect. On the other hand, carcinogenicity is the ability or tendency to produce cancer, and it's more narrow issue than genotoxicity. In spite of the importance of genotoxicity, previous reports from the official bodies, including WHO, have not yet discussed this issue well. Greta will talk about it more in detail later. While most of the international bodies do not assess the carcinogenicity of DU seriously, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, which is a partner of WHO, says in their monograph that internalized alpha-emitting substances are included in the group 1 carcinogen, which means that the substance is a carcinogen to human. As you know, DU is alpha-emitting substances, so it should be said carcinogenic to human. The IARC categorizes the carcinogens based on the 3 evidences. First, human epidemiology. Second, animal experimental data. Third, mechanisms of carcinogenesis. If you look into the studies of carcinogenicity of DU for the weapon use, DU could be included in a group of possibly or probably carcinogenic substances in accordance to the IARC classifications, because we have sufficient evidence in vitro and in vivo experiments, but evidence in human studies remains inadequate. In vitro study is the experiments being done outside non-living bodies, such as cellular studies. In vivo study is experiments being done inside of living studies, such as animal experiments. This is a list of topics on genotoxicity of DU, which we have been reviewing. I don't read all of this to shorten the time, but anyway, we cannot talk all of these items today, so I'll show only a couple of examples of chromosome aberrations briefly today, and Greta will talk about a couple of other items. You can see this is a picture of human chromosomes, which have a typical change due to radiation exposure. Can you find out which one is the abnormal? You know, it's not twisted. You know, usually the chromosome have only one such narrow part. We call it centromere, but you know this big one have 2 centromeres. You know, so it's abnormal one. And actually, this is my own lymphocyte. I exposed. I exposed my lymphocyte by X-ray experimentally. But anyway. The radiation can make a double strand or single strand break of DNA, as you know, with its high energy. It can result in various types of chromosome change. And this is the one of the most typical chromosome changes called dicentric, because it has 2 centromeres, which resulted from the DNA double strand break and its misrepair. And there are several other chromosome changes which can be used as a marker of the impact of radiation as well as chemicals. And this is one of the examples of chromosome study. It was reported by Heike Schrader in 2006. It is still a pilot study, but they examined 16 UK veterans who were sent to Gulf War or Balkans and possibly exposed to DU. The peripheral lymphocytes of veterans showed 5.2 times higher incidence of chromosome aberrations compared to the control. It is still a pilot study, and we need more studies on these markers in various affected areas. And it's additional information, but you can see this ring-formed chromosome. We took it our ICBUW logo. But anyway, this is another example of cellular experiment in vitro. They used human osteoblast cell lines for the test of exposure to DU and other heavy metals. And these three markers of chromosome abnormalities and DNA break can be caused by either radiation or chemicals. While this dicentric formation is only caused by radiation, in this case by DU. So you can see that DU is genotoxic like other heavy metals, or even more toxic with its radiological toxicity. So my conclusion is, after reviewing of more than 50 papers, the conclusion would be research shows that DU is definitely genotoxic and potential or probable carcinogen. And precautionary approach to the use of depleted uranium is scientifically reasonable, and further studies should be done. It's short. And then I will give my mic to Greta.
Yeah. Very nice. You want me to talk here or here? Well,
we're trying to film this.
What?
Stand right here.
Stand right here?
Get a shot at you, yeah.
Oh, all right.
And hold the mic down a little bit.
All right.
Okay, there we go.
I'll try. Okay. Katsumi said I was going to deal with background of this issue of genotoxicity. In general, the UN and international organizations in general in Europe have not dealt with the issue of genotoxicity, as Katsumi said. The World Health Organization, in its 2001 extensive monograph on uranium, did not deal with genotoxicity. There was one mention of genotoxicity. They said it was a possible genotoxin. The International Atomic Agency, Energy Agency, IAEA, and the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCARE, both deal with radioactivity, but IAEA fact sheets on DU do not mention genotoxicity, which can be caused by radiation as well as chemical toxicity. UNSCARE is coming out with a new report, but in its 2006 report, non-target effects of ionizing radiation does not mention genotoxicity. The UN Environmental Program does not directly deal with health effects of DU, but has suggested a precautionary approach towards possible contamination of drinking water supplies and groundwater. And actually, WHO did something similar in their monograph. The Royal Society in the UK published 2 volumes, The Health Hazards of Depleted Uranium Munitions, in 2001 and 2002. It also does not discuss genotoxicity as such, although they review studies of DU exposure that have genotoxic outcomes. They mention that the heavy metal nickel, a known carcinogen, caused similar damage to the genetic material that DU did. In the US, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, came out with a draft toxicological profile for uranium in 2011. Genotoxicity is not dealt with in detail. They note that, quote, as a radionuclide, uranium is potentially genotoxic. However, in 2008, the U.S. National Research Council on a report on depleted uranium and the military, they stated that a number of in vivo and in vitro studies have demonstrated that uranium is a genotoxic metal. Several 2008 publications from the U.S. Institute of Medicine reviewed epidemiological uranium studies. With respect for cancer, they stated that, quote, there is inadequate or insufficient evidence to determine whether an association between uranium and any cancer exists. However, UN and also American government agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, have regulations to protect the public from radiation, such as the basic safety standards developed by IAEA and other UN organizations and international organizations. The WHO has the tolerable daily intake with respect to chemical toxicity. An aside, the food, drug, and cosmetic industries have been doing genotoxicity studies for years. Both the European Food Safety Authority and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration have guidelines for genotoxicity testing, advocating some of the same tests that have been used to show the genotoxicity of depleted uranium. And the Food and Drug Administration is concerned about genotoxic impurities in drugs, and so there's a cost-benefit ratio. The risk of an impurity as opposed to the benefit of the drug. And in some cases, if the genotoxic level of the impurity is too high, they discard the drug, or they have to rethink it. Speaking before the Defense Committee of the Belgian House of Representatives on November 20th, 2006, Dr. Keith Baverstock, formerly of the WHO, stated, there is a significant body of evidence that the exposure of cells in vitro and in vivo to uranium, mostly depleted uranium, does include phenomena that are closely associated with the carcinogenic process, unquote. Slide. Here you have the slide. These were the genotoxic outcomes from exposure to depleted uranium that Dr. Baverstock mentioned to the Belgian Parliament. I will only be able to deal briefly with some of the research done on these two topics. First, generation of double-strand breaks in DNA. The significance of DNA strand breaks is that if they are not repaired or are misrepaired, they can lead to mutations. They are also part of the processes leading to cancer. Double-strand breaks may include single-strand breaks that are close together. A common test for the presence of DNA strand breaks is the COMET assay. DNA is removed from whatever cell is being studied and placed in an electric field. Untreated DNA over to the right is just sort of a spherical object. But the DNA exposed to DU looks like a comet as the strand breaks weaken the DNA and they're pulled towards the opposite electrode in the electric field, forming the tail of a comet. One study by Yazzie and co-workers in 2003 mimicked an experiment done with hexavalent chromium, a known carcinogen. They exposed plasmid DNA to uranyl acetate, a form of DU, and to ascorbate. They also included as part of the experiment using hexavalent chromium. The DU ascorbate mix caused more DNA strand breaks than those caused by the hexavalent chromium ascorbate mixture. And as I said, hexavalent chromium is a known carcinogen. In vitro studies by Monlieu and her team consisted of a series of experiments with rats, where the rats inhaled DU oxides by nose for varying amounts of time. The uranium oxide particles had been collected from workplaces in uranium fuel cycle facilities. Monlieu's experiments were complicated with different dosage levels and different exposures, including pre-exposure for one group of rats. However, the experiments clearly showed that the inhaled DU oxides led to the generation of DNA strand breaks, repeated exposures, and pre-exposures, essentially causing more damage. The next topic is conversion of cells to a tumorigenic state. An in vitro and an in vivo study show that DU can cause cancer. In 1998, Dr. Alexander Miller and her team at the U.S. Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute exposed human bone cells to depleted uranium dioxide chloride for 24 hours. In separate experiments, human bone cells were exposed to nickel sulfate or lead acetate. Nickel sulfate is a known carcinogen. The 24-hour exposure of the human bone cells by the DU compound transformed the cells to a malignant type of cell. DU's transformation frequency was a 9.6-fold increase over that of unexposed controls. Nickel's transformation frequency was just 7, and lead acetate's less. The cells transformed by DU were injected into nude mice. Here you can see you see the normal cells, then they were exposed to DU. They transformed into a malignant type, and the transformed cells, when injected into mice, caused solid tumors within a month. Let's see. The mice inoculated with cells transformed by nickel sulfate also developed tumors. Miller and colleagues did an in vivo study of mice that were implanted with 2 per leg, 6 or 8 DU pellets. 60 days after the pellets were put in the mice were inoculated with murine hematopoietic cells, mice red blood cells, called FDC.P1 cells. 76% of the exposed mice developed full-blown leukemia. The mice with 6 or 8 implanted DU pellets contracted the most leukemia. Unfortunately, the researchers could not determine the mechanism of action in the Miller studies, which would help in determining DU's carcinogenic potential. A lack of understanding of mechanisms of action are mentioned by other researchers as well. However, one cannot extrapolate from these studies to say that DU is a human carcinogen. Conclusion. The U.S. National Research Council has stated that DU is a genotoxic metal. DU exposure has been shown to lead to DNA double-strand breaks, which can lead to mutations. DU exposure has been found to transform human cells to a malignant type and to cause leukemia in cancer, in mice. In mice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Katsumi, Gretel, and Wim, for these very important research papers. We will open now a time for, if you have questions, for either of our presenters. And also, I know among you there are a lot of people who have worked on this issue, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Veterans for Peace, so please feel free to share also your experiences now. Thank you very much. Yeah. Come here. No, 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 no. We welcome you to the stage, Bob.
Thank you very much for making me look so big. I'm the co-president of IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm asking or making an observation in that respect. I think this is very useful, first and foremost, for scientists and other interested Ivorians. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the work that we are doing, using that chart over there, ban of this and that, and if there's a way in which we could cook this message so that it's edible by the diplomats and the people that make decisions. I don't know for you, in my country, Zambia, most politicians can count by the country, you see. They understand the question of money, but reading is another discussion. So is there a way we could simplify this so that the verdict is still quite out on a number of issues, so that people sort of touch it as it is? It's good for me, yeah, because I can argue this and pass an exam, but for my member of parliament, believe you me, yours are clever, I watch TV here, but mine, they count. So is there a way we could do it differently? Secondly is, yeah, of course we can't manufacture guinea pigs or more people to observe over time and study. Spare that the effect of this, you can't even taste it, you can't smell it. So instead of opening up another venue of fighting with people, is there a way we could do it in a way that is a bit more convincing in terms of things people see? What I see, I remember. What I hear, I forget. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, probably best to come up here.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. That's indeed a very good question. A couple of things can be said about that. First of all, this is a complex issue. For example, if you deal with cluster munitions, if you deal with landmines, you can see the immediate effect of the impact of a weapon. So you step on a landmine and it will explode and it can kill or injure somebody. With depleted uranium, it's invisible, it has a long-term effect. And there is a lack of studies that show a clear effect between DU and the health problems. So that's why we try to come up with this approach, on this precautionary approach. Like what can we know and how should we act based on what we know? And what can we know? Well, it's been the studies have been presented so far by Alexander Miller and other. I think there are over 40 peer-reviewed studies that show the potential effects. This is as far as we can go. Like what I mentioned earlier, if you want to do long-term studies on exposed populations, it's nearly impossible, because we don't know where it has been used, and we don't know as well. And it's also difficult as well to get money and funding and capacity to do those studies. So that's why we say, okay, based on what we know so far, we say you should stop using it. But the other problem is these concerns. For example, in Iraq, you can see the pictures there, and as for campaign-wise, we've been very hesitant in showing these pictures and linking it directly with the EU, because it's quite difficult. I mean, there may be very many other causes as well, and as a doctor you probably know that. So we're very hesitant in doing that, because it will backfire against us. And I can tell you from my own experience as well in Iraq, that if you see the pollution because of the oil industry, people burning plastics in the street, they're being exposed to a lot of other stuff as well. So how to make this as a simple message and to get it across? Well, it depends who you're talking to. If I talk to European states or Western states, they have no army of researchers who defending their positions, and which it makes it really difficult, because they have a vested interest in using that, or they are under pressure of those who are using it not to change their position or to be skeptical about it. So that's why we say we should leave it up to the public to decide if it's acceptable or not, and that's why we're coming up with these reports, showing these concerns, trying to make this report, the technical reports, simple as possible. I can understand from a scientific perspective something that's difficult, but that's so far the best we can do, and it's really hard with this. I'm happy to hear any suggestions how you can turn this in a more simpler message, but still a scientific valid message, because making simple one-on-one equations is with this kind of material is really difficult to do. So that's why we try to come up with these concerns, trying to raise the problems in doing good research, and showing what has done so far is already, in our case, enough in saying, okay, this should be banned from conventional weapons. But it's a struggle. We're trying to find out what's achievable with what we have. So I'd be very happy to hear any other suggestions from people who say, okay, this could be a message, and I think I would really open up the floor to people if they think, well, have you thought about this or thought about that, because we're just a couple of people working on this now.
Thank you, Wim. Any other question or comment? Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you guys for being here today and for your time. I'm a senior at Barnard College, clean neuroscience major, and I'm also part of Wolf and my mentor.
Could you go up to the microphone?
Oh. Okay, so.
15 minutes of fame.
Thank you.
Okay. So my question is, what is the difference? Well, I have two questions and a couple of suggestions as well, but I guess I'll start off with the questions. What is the difference between uranium and depleted uranium, and how has this, or how does it contribute to genotoxicity and subsequently its possible carcinogenicity? And my second question is with respect to the Miller study. The concentration of the DU that the cells were emitted, would you say that it's comparable to the concentration of DU that the people in these areas are being exposed to? And as for sort of like pitching your work to people, I would say that maybe providing information on the scope and breadth and the number of people that are affected by DU emissions and alternative means of weaponry would be quite effective. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe you can find many information from our website, but as for the difference between depleted uranium and uranium, I have some other. Yeah, you know. Wait a moment.
Do it by head.
Sorry. Wait a moment, I'm sorry. While I'm searching, you can.
Yes, all right.
Gretel, over here, I think is best.
Do I need to?
Yeah, you have to, yeah, we can't.
Well, I'll start. Uranium and depleted uranium are chemically alike. Radiologically, natural uranium, which is found in the Earth's surface in a very unconcentrated manner, if it is concentrated, it has depleted uranium has 60% of the radiation that concentrated natural uranium has. However, depleted uranium differs from natural uranium in as much as, I was just going to say, in as much as depleted uranium, because of the way it's used in weapons, you can breathe it in. Natural uranium, you don't necessarily breathe in. Now, there are different isotopes, and isotopes have to do with the number of neutrons that a radioactive substance has. I don't remember exactly, but uranium DU there is mostly made up of uranium-238, which is a heavy substance. It doesn't have much uranium-235 because that's been taken out of the uranium it was made from, so that's why it's depleted. Natural uranium over there, you see, has quite a lot of uranium-238, but it has much more uranium-234, which is quite intense, and then it has uranium-235. So they're quite different radiologically, but the same chemically. Now, there have been studies done on uranium since the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 1940s. Research on depleted uranium has really only taken off in the 1990s. It's a relatively new field, you could say, in a certain way. Although, because it's chemically like uranium, studies about uranium miners and millers and so forth have been used to cast some inkling as to what depleted uranium is like. Now let's see, what else can I does that clarify at all? All right.
Second question about the Miller study?
Yes. Which Miller study?
The one in which the bone cells were exposed to...
And the mice became, yes. Offhand, I can't give you the figures. I think the thing is with, I know Miller has been interested in the situation of the veterans having embedded DU fragments from being in friendly fire incidences. And I can't remember whether this particular study they tried to duplicate the concentration you might have come across in the battlefield. I really can't say that that's the case. The thing is about animal and cellular studies is, especially animal studies, because they don't want to use too many animals, they often use high doses of whatever material they're investigating. But can you add to that? But the Monyear study about the rats that inhale DU through their noses, they tried to have the concentrations similar to the concentrations you run into on the battlefield. But the thing is, there were various exposures, so that it sort of covered a wide range. The other fact of the matter was that the concentrations that the mice were subjected to were greater than would have existed in the workplace where the dust came from.
Thank you. And the Miller study is available, this very same one, Gretel? Is that the one that's out on the table?
No.
But you could, if she wants more information, you could send it to her.
Yes, I can send you the information on the study. If you write, if you mention, well, I'll take your name later. Okay. Oh, I was going to just say, yes, we do have a review of in vitro and in vivo studies by Dr. Alexander Miller there on the tables for you to take if you want.
Thank you. Any other? Yeah, please come up.
I'll also take my chance.
and they cheat. I have seen their claim that it's not toxic, and then I go in and cite federal studies that actually do say it's toxic, and that lasts for a couple of weeks, and then some character will push it away. And so I invite all of us to participate in submitting. Wikipedia is open to the readership to maintain the toxicity. But I wanted to specifically mention a mechanism of toxicity that I'm not familiar with the literature, how generally known it is. But basically the proposition is that even though theoretically, or in fact, the amount of radioactive energy is low, once a particle is lodged somewhere in the body, there is a gradient from a fraction of a millimeter to, let's say, a whole centimeter. And somewhere between the actual location of the point and within this range of a centimeter is just the right amount of radioactivity to cause mutation damage. And so even though the US government says it's not a problem because it's low toxicity, the reality is the reason it is a carcinogen is because there is this operation of the gradient, and somewhere in the vicinity of the particle the radiation is just enough to cause mutation damage.
Right on. And then
I'd just like to say that Wikipedia, I don't think, is an awfully good source. They're not always reliable. At least we found that about 7 or 8 years ago, and what Joe Friendly has said leads me to think it hasn't changed. But I guess it's the readership. Readership could write in and make changes in it, but...
Yeah. Rachel.
My name is Rachel Clark. I'm an interpreter, and I'm pretty much amateur in this field. I just started working with the Hibakusha, survivors of atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2010, when a whole bunch of those survivors came for NTP conference here. And since then, I started to learn finally about what was going on in my native country, 1945. And as a Japanese citizen, I was born in that country. I was educated in that country, and nuclear issue was such a small regional issue. That's how we were educated. So that was the issue of Hiroshima's, that was issue of Nagasaki's, not the Japan as a nation. And since 2010, I realized that this whole trend of undermining effective radiation was kind of strongly influenced by this country's government. And I was so shocked that the specialized hospital to treat those survivors were built 1975. For 30 years, they were completely neglected by their own government, by the global community, and right now, the same thing is going on all over the world. Fukushima as well, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and some remote area in China. Those minor, small community people along the Silk Road, they were completely ignored by the horrible things that they've been experienced since nuclear test site. And here, this is the gathering of disarmament camp, correct? And I don't see people who are more familiar to me. Those people who are against the nuclear power plants, those people who are gung-ho about Fukushima, let's say Fukushima, they're not here. So what I noticed was, just going back to that lady's question, difference between natural uranium and depleted uranium. That was the difference between consumption and waste management, right? Natural uranium, when they mine, they dig up dirt from very deep in the ground, right? So when I saw some YouTube video of Zambia, gentleman from that king, they dig up 1 ton of dirt, right? And from 1 ton of dirt, you can extract only 200 grams of uranium. And what happens to the rest of the majority of dirt? They are just abandoned in open air. And they are already radioactive, contaminating a whole area, causing a lot of human hazards, and also contaminating the drinking water and everything and so forth, right? And the mining is dangerous, then the consumption is dangerous. Look at, I've been going to all the rallies and study sections and all over, then realize that the nuclear power plants are not safe. They're leaking. They're causing a lot of cancers, people in the area. And after consumption, the waste management is horrible. I just met the lady from New Mexico the other day in Washington, D.C. She claimed that in New Mexico, they do mining uranium, they do milling uranium, and after consumed all over the U.S., nuclear waste are brought to New Mexico. And the indigenous people are suffering by all these ramifications. Okay, this is not energy issue only. This is not the nuclear issues only. This is also racial issue, class issue. It's all combined. And I would like to see more people who are against the nuclear power plants. And when I go to other camps meeting, I would like to see you too. And I think we need a stronger coalition, because nuclear issue is not only environment, not only weapons, it's not only clans. We all together, I think we have a stronger, much powerful coalition, and we need more sponsors. Look at the United Nations, Office of Disarmament. We do have a strong, very bright people working there tirelessly. We are all, and the UN also has a department that deals with peaceful usage of nuclear energy, and that department has 20 times more budget in a year compared to ODA. So this, we have to, balance out this weird situation. These departments should not be apart. They are to be same level, right? If we want to ban nuclear everything, we have to get together. And my question is, I'm sorry, please correct me if I were wrong. 1954 Geneva Treaty banned chemical weapons in the war zones, and through this all nice study explanation, I understood that clearly, in my opinion, nuclear weapons are chemical weapons, and why are they still being used, and what's hindering to admit nuclear weapons as chemical weapons? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your contribution. And indeed, I mean, it's if it comes to the impact of nuclear energy, there are a lot of challenges, and I think a lot of people here already are active in these different kind of communities. For example, the work of Katsumi is also working on the impact of nuclear facilities, and also on miners in Kazakhstan, was it, I think? Yeah, so anyway, but I think also on a more practical level, there are organizations like Greenpeace and others who are actively campaigning against this. And for me personally, I can only say, I mean, I cannot clone myself, so I only have the energy to work on certain issues. And I mean, in our organization, we also work on nuclear weapons, and there also is work done on what kind of impact nuclear energy has, and the whole debate about the use of nuclear energy in relation to nuclear weapons. But to come to your second question, because I know a bit more about that, the Chemical Weapons Convention is about weapons which primary effect is a chemical effect. Depleted uranium is a conventional weapon which uses heavy metal, which is chemically toxic, but it's not the primary effect of the weapon. It's not its effect is not the chemical toxicity, but its effect was it was designed to penetrate armor. So that's why it's not part of the chemical weapons convention, because it's not a chemical weapon in that case. So, for example, there are a lot of other components that are part of weapons, like a lot of bullets are made of lead, which is also chemically toxic. So basically all conventional weapons have parts or components or substances which are potentially dangerous, but it's about, the whole discussion is of course about were they designed to be that way, and in this case states say no, the primary function of the weapon was to destroy a certain target by the way it was designed, but effect is not to make people sick. That's a secondary effect. And then of course we have now the debate, does it make people sick? And as long as that's not been directly been proven, states will always say, well, that's not the effect of the weapon, so therefore we can still use it. I know some states I've talked to say, well, if there's any direct proof, we will reconsider our position. So I hope that answered your question a bit about why it's not part of the Chemical Weapons Convention.
So that's why we want to make a specific convention to ban uranium weapons, you know.
I'm more recent to this issue. Maybe 2008 is when I became involved, and because we hosted the first Latin American conference on uranium weapons, a friend from the University of Costa Rica produced a documentary. We have only one copy now, but anybody that's interested, it's called Uranio 238, Uranium-238, the Pentagon's Dirty Pool. And it's half an hour in English with Spanish subtitles. And it was very interesting, an effort that I want to share of some now friends in Brazil who organized the first uranium film festival. And so it'd be very interesting, Rachel, if you can follow up on this, because we submitted our documentary, and in 2011 we went to Rio, where there were about 50 or 60 documentaries covering the whole cycle. So from uranium mining all over the world to the dangers of nuclear weapons, nuclear power plants, nuclear energy, and the use of the waste in weapons and wars. And so that is an interesting effort. They had a second festival in Rio just last year, and in Berlin about 3 weeks ago. And so that's interesting, bringing in all of these issues through documentaries. And then about a month ago in Washington, D.C., an effort called Campaign Against Nuclear. You're probably familiar with them. I was also interested in their website, because they're also bringing in organizations and people who are working on the whole issue, again, just like these friends from Brazil. So there are efforts who are trying to, coordinate and get together, share information, and bring in more people to work together. Yeah. Any more questions or comments over there?
Hello, my name is Susanne Urban from the Nordic Network to Ban Uranium Weapons. In Norway, we have been working to ban uranium weapons since 2005, and we have been learning more for each year. I've been wondering about one thing. In Norway, we have lots of radon gas. Most health authorities in the world, they accept radon as cancerogenous, that it causes cancer. What's the difference between radon gas and uranium that you inhale?
You know that as a alpha emitting substance, it's my opinion, but both of them, uranium and radon are alpha emitting substance. In that sense, I think it's the same. In alpha particle, alpha ray. Sorry, my poor English. Alpha ray. Then, and as I show in my presentation, and IARC, its partner of WHO, clearly say that alpha emitting particles are carcinogen to humans. And as scientists, maybe Glenn will add something later, but as a scientist, radon and also uranium, internalized uranium as a small particles, it's not equal, but the effect which can cause cancer or some other things are the same. So it's unfair to distinguish these two things. And the WHO clearly said that radon should be controlled, limited, and they have such safety standard or something like that, but they never say about depleted uranium. And I give you one episode. You know, we talked about this Miller, Dr. Miller. Actually, she is working for the military institute, but her studies are very nice. We love it. It clearly shows that the depleted uranium is toxic, genotoxic. But you know we found some months ago. We found in her website that she published last year, 2011, published a WHO technical report update of her in vivo and vitro study. And we really want to get it because it was published by WHO officially. And I sent twice the letter to Dr. Miller, but no reply. And a few days ago, I wrote to WHO and asking for this report. And just yesterday, I found that Dr. Miller deleted that reference from her website. So it's very strange, and so we really want to know what happened. But WHO, we visited them several times, but every time they are unfortunately nearly political.
So yes, come on. The AFRI that Miller works for is part of the Department of Defense. It actually is, and it's really remarkable in a way that they've been able to do what they've done. Joe.
Just one important difference between radon and depleted uranium is the half-life. The half-life of radon is of the order of 30 days. The half-life of depleted uranium is less than that. Yeah. And the half-life of depleted uranium is something of the order of 4.5 billion years. Okay. The difference. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. So I would like to make several comments. And one is on the issue of epidemiological evidence versus animal experiments. So I think intrinsically, epidemiological studies are very difficult to establish a causal relationship. And it's rarely done. It requires, controlled populations, unexposed populations, and large populations in which the exposure is known, and they're difficult to control. and they very frequently are inconclusive, as we've heard here. But animal experiments and cell culture experiments can be very carefully controlled. If you can imagine, we were a pharmaceutical company, and we had developed a wonderful new drug, and we were presenting our data to the Food and Drug Administration to get permission to market it. We would have to present animal data, cell culture data, and very importantly, we would have to present genotoxicity data. And there's a very simple bacterial test for DNA damage for genotoxicity that's called the Ames test. And it's relatively cheap, and the Ames test can be done really in a day. And you have to show that to the Food and Drug Administration. You have to demonstrate non-genotoxicity and non-teratogenicity, the ability to cause birth defects. So just to, if you had a wonderful new drug and you told the Food and Drug Administration it's definitely positive in this bacterial test for DNA damage, for mutations, the game is over. The Food and Drug Administration would say goodbye. We don't need to hear anymore. And also, I'm not sure if, I don't think that was explicitly mentioned in the discussion, but the form of uranium that exists inside the human body or the mammalian body is called the uranyl ion. It has two positive charges, and it binds to DNA with high affinity. And so if you had a drug and you disclose, you're getting permission to market it, and you told the Food and Drug Administration, well, our wonderful drug binds to DNA with high affinity, the game's over. They would say, thank you, go home. We're not going to give you permission to market that drug, no matter what its pharmacological properties are. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to another point. It has been argued by spokespersons for the Pentagon that depleted uranium weapons were not used in Fallujah, Iraq. There were, in 2004, from early April till mid-May, there was a massive assault on Fallujah. And also from early November to early December, there was another second assault in 2004. And essentially, several spokespersons for the Pentagon have said, well, why should we use depleted uranium munitions? There were no tank battles in Fallujah. The people of Fallujah did not have armored vehicles. So why should we use depleted uranium weapons, with the implication that uranium weapons are only used as kinetic energy penetrators, as anti-armor weapons. But I think there are many indications that the military has incorporated uranium into a number of weapon systems, fuel, air bombs, and various bunker buster bombs. And in fact, a year ago, an important paper appeared which said, which measured almost 40 different elements in the soil, the water, and in human hair samples from some men and women in Fallujah. And they, among the abnormalities they found in all the samples was there were definitely elevated levels of uranium, but it was not depleted uranium. It was very close to natural uranium. So that was an interesting observation. And it hasn't been, widely absorbed by the activist community. Now, I would like to just go back to Dr. Alexandra Miller, who has made many important contributions since really the mid-1990s on the ability of uranium to damage DNA, to damage cells, to put them into the malignant phenotype. And that's quite remarkable. She works in this little institute that was founded, I believe, in 1960 or 1961. That's called the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute. It's right next to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda. It's right across the road from the National Institutes of Health. And and particularly with respect to uranium, they've done some very good work. But, and in 2002, Dr. Miller and her colleagues started a very important study in mice, a special strain of mice in which you actually could check in various organs whether or not mutations have occurred. It's ordinarily that's difficult in animal studies. So Dr. Miller made a very brief but very notable status report on this study in early March of 2004 at MIT. And Glenn Lawrence and myself were present at that conference. And when I heard it, my reaction was, you know, that was an excellent study. It was, it could have been done 10 years before it was done, right after the first Gulf War, but the technology to do it was available in 1991, 92. But anyhow, they did it. And it seemed like at the very latest, by 2007, that full study would be published. But it never was published. It disappeared. And one could ask, like, are the research records still around? Are the experimental samples still around? Or who caused that study to be suppressed? So although, you know, some important studies have come from the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute with respect to uranium toxicity, they're under the control of the Department of Defense. And actually, in this particular study, there was, in the mice exposed to the highest dose of uranium, 80% of the mice developed cancers, compared to the unexposed mice where none of the mice developed cancers. And among those cancers were ones that previously hadn't been associated with uranium exposure. Those were testicular cancer, bladder cancer, thyroid cancer. They also observed lung cancers, but these were mice that didn't have a exposure by inhalation. Anyhow, so those were important observations that have been suppressed. Okay, so I think I made all the points that I wanted to, so thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Does anyone want to comment on what comment said? And what we'll do is we'll take one more question or comment, and we can stay in the room until 9, and so we invite you to have some more drinks or something to eat, and to please sign the sign-up sheet, and also to get information to help us sign on to the petition that we're circulating worldwide to our U.S. authorities. Thank you. First, John or Wim?
I can briefly answer the
Yeah.
question. Well, I can only say two things about the Fallujah study and about use of the DU in Fallujah and the Fallujah study. Use of the DU in Fallujah, what I understood so far, when I was in Iraq, I talked with one Iraqi researcher who worked for the Ministry of Science and Technology, and he's been very supportive for our calls, and actually has been put in jail because he was too vocal about it. But he went in there with their team, they did a study on DU, they couldn't find any elevated levels of radioactivity. What I did find there, however, was white phosphorus, which is known to be used in Fallujah. And they found elements of white phosphorus there. So I think when it comes to the use of DU there, and I can't say that he is biased, this researcher, so I trust his judgment and also judgment from what they studied there, is in 2004, indeed it seems unlikely that DU has been used. The Ministry of Environment, however, found 2 tanks who were contaminated with DU, but that was probably from 2003 and not from 2004. So what we have so far, there's nothing points to the fact that there was a large amount of DU used there, and it's likely the birth defects we've seen there are or by white phosphorus. And recently there was another study published last week. Other toxics were part of components of weapons who might be contributed to the problems in Fallujah. And also there were 3 chemical factories who were attacked in 2003 by the Americans, probably also released large quantities of chemicals in the environment. So that's what the best knowledge I have so far, and so far only what we can say about it is only the facts that we know. And about the study on the hair samples, that was a really badly designed study. We talked with scientists from the UK, and the collection of hair samples was not done very well, and they reassessed the same samples, and there was, I think, Gretel or Katsumi knows more about the study. It was study done by Chris Busby and others, and in my personal opinion, I don't think that study is very scientifically credible. So for us, we cannot really support that study, but I think the other study that was released last week was quite interesting.
I just wanted to say
We don't have to leave right now, but Gretel, how about if John? Okay, Gretel, yeah. And then informally, please, we're invited to stay and talk more to Tom and all of us. We can stay here until 9, so there's time.
just a brief mention of the fact that ICBUW did a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act, on depleted uranium in Fallujah. And after months, and after going through different military departments, we got something from CENTCOM saying that they had no records for April, May 2004. But in November, December, no depleted uranium rounds were used at all. They just had 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So that's what we came up with.
Well,
Thank you.
That's what they told you.
That's what they told us. That's right. Well, we don't know, but that's
For
they.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes, and I remember we all learned in school this famous saying of René Descartes. I think therefore I am. But I think he said a much more, something that every scientist and every citizen should always have in their mind, and that is to be suspicious of everything. And that's an important principle in science.
We can only go by the facts, and even Iraqi researchers didn't find anything.
Oh, yes. So now, I also was in Iraq last February and March, and I visited Fallujah. And it became quickly apparent to me that the pediatricians in Fallujah and Ramadi, violated a ban by the Ministry of Health that they were not supposed to talk about birth defects to journalists or any foreign visitors. And Dr. Alani in Fallujah and Dr. Zayed Alani in Ramadi, have published papers, and there have now been several papers published in Fallujah. And so it became apparent to me that, number one, there's sort of 2 camps in Iraq. There are the physicians and scientists at medical colleges and in the teaching hospitals who have a genuine interest in this, and there are people in the ministries, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Higher Education, and various other ministries who are very cautious. And it's the ones in the ministries that have Geiger counters and other good equipment. But by and large, in the medical colleges and the teaching hospitals, they don't have equipment and facilities to monitor environmental radiation. And so I think, and if I make a comment, I can't understand how white phosphorus could persist in the environment. It's extremely reactive, and in the presence of oxygen, and it's converted into another compound that's extremely reactive in the presence of water. And so the only thing that would be left would be phosphoric acid, which is a very weak acid, and it's like a buffer at pH 2. And also, I don't understand how, although most of the physicians I met in Iraq believed that white phosphorus contributed to birth defects in Fallujah, but I cannot understand in my own mind mechanistically how white phosphorus would cause birth defects. It doesn't persist in the environment.
I just wanted to make one point about the distinctions between what we might call, well, the uranium that's been used in the nuclear industry and so on. The particle sizes that people dealt with in studying things during that era of the development of the nuclear industry were quite large. You know, they were concerned about people being exposed to dust in the environment where they were working. But in the case of the depleted uranium weapons, when they strike a hard object and go up in flames, the particles that are produced in the smoke are extremely small. They're nanoparticles, and they get absorbed very quickly into the body, whereas the larger particles that they were studying before didn't get absorbed very quickly. They lodged in the lungs and stayed there for a very long time without dissolving and getting the uranium into the body. So that was a major difference between using it in these ballistic weapons compared to, other uses for the uranium.
Thank you. Well, we're going to close this formal moment now. Nydia wanted to say something, and we can stay and informally continue.
We should acknowledge her absence, Rosalie Bertels.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and especially to Katsumi, Gretel, and Wim, and to our friend Doug, who's not here with us today, but thank you all for coming.